Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion, The Future of Privacy, What to Expect in 2022. My name is Lisa Shulindina. I am Communications Manager here at Kaspersky, and today I'll be moderating this session. I'm here today with Rachel Gibson. She's the Director of the Center for Victim Service Professionals at the National Center for Victims of Crime in the United States. I'm also joined by Jon Callas, the Director of Technology Projects at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and Vladislav Tushkanov, Senior Data Scientist at Kaspersky. Welcome, guys. Global connectivity underpins the most basic functions of our society, such as logistics, government services, and banking. And we connect via instant messengers and order food via delivery apps instead of going to the shops. We participate in conferences that take place in virtual conference rooms, such as this one, and remote work has become the new normal. All these processes have consequences for privacy, and we're here today to discuss them. So today we will focus on what has happened in regards to privacy in 2021 and what we are to expect in this area in the near future. Feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box and we will address them at the end of the discussion. Also, this session will be recorded, so you will receive a link to the recording shortly after the webinar. And before we kick off with the discussion, we would like to hear from the audience. We will be launching a poll. You will see it here on the screen. Please share your answer and we will discuss the results a bit later today. So 2021 was the year of change, and we want to see what are the main trends and events observed in the privacy sector during the last year. I'd like to invite Vladislav to share his vision and share what he had predicted for to happen in last year and comment on what we've actually seen in 2021 when it comes to privacy. Vlad, please go ahead.
Yes. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And yes, privacy in 2021 and the trends that we're going to observe in 2022. First of all, I'm mostly here to talk about the technological perspective on this. And the most exciting trend that I see is the shift towards more privacy-preserving and privacy-enhancing technologies. So what we've seen is that for many companies, big tech companies like Google and Apple, there's been a shift from collecting as much data as possible to, trying not to collect data if it is possible. So, for example, there's been private compute core in Android or on-device data processing in Siri, and all that kinds of stuff that's going on with privacy enhancing technologies, etc. However, we've also seen a lot of not so beautiful stuff, right? Companies still try to trick people into giving up more privacy by, even if there are opportunities for people to use services in a privacy preserving way, still companies try to use dark patterns to extract data from people, to extract consent for data processing, etc. So another thing which I think is interesting is also that many privacy preserving services, so whose actual business value is to be private, right? VPNs, search engines, etc., private and end-to-end encrypted messaging technologies, they've really seen a lot of growth in the last. And I think what this shows is that people are interested when privacy is a business proposition, a value proposition. And I think it's also a good thing to see, and I hope a trend that will continue.
Vlad. And Don and Rachel, what are your main takeaways for 2021? Did you see the same as what Vlad shared, or maybe you have a different perspective? Rachel, I'd like to welcome you to go first.
Thank you. So I bring up working with victims of crime, especially when we think about domestic violence victims who are experiencing what we call technology facilitated abuse. And as we think about 2021, I think it's important for us to remember, and I was just telling a colleague yesterday that I felt 2020 in the same year, right? We're still in a pandemic. People are still struggling with jobs. And so there's, and that they were facing in 2020 and 2021. And I see that, you know, moving for last point is that we're seeing more people really taking a step back to look at how does privacy affect my everyday life. It's not that I'm keeping a diary and putting a lock, but it's my online life, my digital life needs a key now. Like I lock my home. I have an alarm system in my home. I have a Ring camera in my home. And so these are some of the things that I do to keep myself and my family safe. And these are some of the things that we have to think about, especially for victims of crime, like domestic violence victims whose online lives need to be safe and secure. And so we've seen a lot of conversations around what does privacy really mean for the person who has the most extreme user case, someone who may be living with a disability, a trans Black woman who is trying to survive, immigrant who is fleeing an abusive person or violence in their home country. And so these users, what are the needs? Privacy by design approach to think about how do we build our product for the least person, the person who has the most extreme user case. Because when we build our products for those people, everyone benefits. It's like that. I don't know if y'all know the movie Will Come. If you build it accessibly, if you build it with privacy in mind, they will come, meaning that it benefits the collective. And we all benefit when privacy is at the core of the work that we do.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I think it's quite an important takeaway that companies are focusing more and more on vulnerable proposition. John, what are your main takeaways? Would you like to add, please?
Yes, I agree with them both. I mean, Vlad's absolutely right that what we're seeing now is an interest in privacy technologies and people actually building them. It's early days, as Rachel was saying, and it's also good that we are bringing in the margins of what's going on, that we're dealing with things where privacy isn't just what happens to you know, your personal address on the internet, but it includes the autonomy of your own devices in your own house and what they're doing to you, what they're doing for you, and who has access to it for them. And being able to continue that to make sure that people can do things like, you know, if you think, for example, that somebody has broken into your house, how do you know that things are okay again? How do you recover from one of these things? Because just like there are awful things that happen to everybody, like you get into a car accident, you get into these other issues to deal with some sort of data and privacy problem in our lives. And the good news is that it's being taken seriously, and we're starting to figure out how we dig ourselves out from personal messes. There's but we're making progress and people believe that this is a real problem. And that's the biggest change that I see and really encouraging.
Thank you. Yeah, that does sound uplifting, I think. But so we have people taking privacy seriously, but there are still quite a few fights going on around privacy. So John, this is a question to you. Which fights are we beginning to win when it comes to data privacy, and from whom we are winning? What would you say about that?
The biggest thing that we have won is that in 2021, we reached a barrier where 90% of all the biggest used sites, not the total number of sites, but ones by people use them, they're all using SSL, they're all encrypted. This is something that EFF promoted as a completely out of the blue, how would you ever do that 10 years ago? And we started with things, building tools ourselves. We built browser extensions that would upgrade people to TLS. We started working with Let's Encrypt to make it so that any site in the world can get an SSL certificate. And this last year, we retired our HTTPS Everywhere web extension. And that's because HTTPS basically is everywhere. And that the places where it's not, the web browsers themselves are automatically doing all the right thing. And that's what is making it so that the sort of widespread surveillance that we've known about for the last decade or so is significantly constrained because the default is now that web traffic is encrypted. The other big thing is that there's consensus that tracking cookies and tracking people around the web is bad. We don't know what we want to do with that yet. Our extension is called Privacy Badger. It removes tracking from your web browsing. Now it's built into Firefox. Tracker blocking is built into Safari. There are other privacy-oriented browsers like Brave, like Vivaldi. DuckDuckGo is moving into this space. This is a lot of what Vlad was saying, is that people are moving into this space. And Google has a bunch of ideas about what they want to do, because Google is simultaneously a company that builds a lot of really good tools and the biggest ad agency in the world. And so they collect the most information. So they're both of these things at the same time. And they know they need to do something, they just don't know what it is yet. So in the next few years, that's where we're going to see the progress, is that we're going to be removing tracking just the way that over the last few years, we got everything encrypted.
Great, thank you. So these are the positives, but if we look back at 2021, are there some things that you were hoping and expecting that would happen in terms of privacy and they just didn't? And this is for everyone, I'd say.
For me, I'd say that actually I expected a little bit more from privacy preserving technologies, not in the meaning of the speed with which companies move with them, because I think the speed is just astonishing with all the new stuff coming in, but in how they were implemented, because we know there were at least two setbacks. First is neural hash, and the other one is what Jon tangentially mentioned, removal of cookies by using that cookieless technology by Google, which actually was not a very good implementation. And so it was decided that's best not to implement it and wait for a better stuff to come. So basically, what we also need to understand that the technology is not the only thing that we need. We also need the infrastructure around, like how it's implemented, how it's controlled, how transparent it is. So, and I think that is still the thing to work on.
Thank you, Vlad. Moving on, probably also to the darker side of 2021. Rachel, you mentioned that there has been some developments around tools that would help victims and survivors of domestic violence. But if we go back and talk about challenges, what do you think were the main issues and what has changed, if it hasn't?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And as we were talking, I was thinking about this in terms of privacy is a luxury. Privacy is not affordable for most people, right? Because you have to buy antivirus software. You have to be able to keep that updated. You have to be able to afford to be private. We, especially here in the US, we're so used to giving people our information because they maybe are in a position of power. If we think about victims of domestic violence and victims of general, when they come to me for help, I'm in a position of power because I'm the person that has the resources. When we think about tech companies asking for information, people just think, well, these people know what they're doing. I don't know anything about technology, so maybe they need my information. Maybe they need to be collecting it. And so there is a luxury that comes with being private that many victims of crime aren't able to afford. We use this phrase called the digital divide, and it's a barrier to accessing services, legal support in our work, court support, and even technology. Right. And so that's one of the things that I think we heard of a lot during 2021 is that this digital divide is bigger than we ever thought it to be. When we think about rural communities and who has access to high-speed internet, when we think about tribal communities and their access to technology, their access to the internet, communities of color, in the Black community, it was reported that phones is the #1 tool that Black folks use in the community. And our phones are our computers. I bank from my phone. I order my pizza from my phone. I talk to my friends and family. I was there for the birth of my nephew a few years ago with messaging video. And so it is a big piece of who I am. And so, if I don't have access to safe technology, if I don't have access, not only just the technology, but the information, because I think there's another piece when we talk about digital divide and privacy, is that most people don't understand what does it mean to be private and secure online when the messaging we get from social media or from companies is to be social. That's what social means, right? So the messaging is mixed. And so for many victims of crime and domestic violence victims, intimate partner violence victims, that's one of the barriers is helping them understand to be private and when can I be social? And that is something that the general user has to think about. But for victims of domestic violence, that is even more heightened because not only is it when can I be social and when is it not, but that can mean risk of life or death if I'm social or unsocial in a way. Because I think we talk about the way in which we share information, but for many victims, if I keep information from my abuser, that could be a time that the violence that I'm experiencing escalates. And so I think, it's really about helping victims and survivors understand what their rights are to privacy and how to use privacy in a strategic way. And it's lessening that digital divide for people who may not understand. And when I worked for the National Network to End Domestic Violence, I spent a lot of time reading terms of service and community standards. And I'm trained to do this work and I would fall asleep because they're boring, right? Like they don't write them for the everyday person. And so tech companies have a due diligence to make sure that people understand what they're getting into before they get into it. And if I choose to use this service, then I know the risks, I know the benefits, because it's not just always about risk, but it can be about benefits too for many victims as we think about 2021 and people are still isolating, people are still not able to communicate or be in person in shared space with family. And so technology opened up the doors for people to be able to still have family reunions and family, get-togethers and finding forums. And when you think about the way in which social media is used for accountability, good, bad, or indifferent. And so there are those benefits that, people can think about as they're using technology. And so I think really that digital divide is probably the biggest piece that I would think about.
Thank you, Rachel. That's very insightful. Actually, my next question was going to be whether general public is gaining more awareness on privacy matters, but it feels like that would be uncalled for after your speech.
And sorry, I didn't mean to move us ahead.
No worries. But I think what would be the next thing I want to ask is what can we do? So you spoke about tech companies and how they need to make sure that users understand for but what else can be done? Should the governments do something? Should other companies do something? And Rachel, John, Vlad, this is for all of you. Like, what can we do next to make it better?
I think that we need to understand what companies can do well and what governments can do well and what they do poorly. And this is something that Rachel has touched on, Vlad's touched on, I mentioned, is that many of these entities, whether they're companies or governments, are doing things that we both approve of and we don't approve of. Is that there are a lot of these things where on the one hand, companies are starting to clean things up and create privacy preserving solutions. And yet there's a lot of stuff that's going on otherwise. In the government side, there's a huge question about what governments ought to be doing for regulation. And we do not have a consensus on what the correct thing to do is yet. And at the same time, governments around the world are working very hard to undermine our privacy and security as well, that they will want to get into people's devices ostensibly for crime fighting or something like that. And they want to be able to get into a device, but these are what our lives are on. Rachel was talking about it. Most people in the world are using their phone as their main device. And what's kept on it is their most intimate secrets. It is their most private lives. And many governments want to be able to just open that up and look through it unrestricted. And so we need to be pushing back on that in the same way that we push back in the private sector on other things that we don't like.
And I would just agree with, everything that John just said, because my colleagues and I, and even my husband and I, just had this conversation around privacy versus safety, right? And I feel like there's two different camps, and there was some terse conversations in our house because one of us was for strong privacy and the other one was talking about, well, what about safety, right? But I don't think you have to have either or. I think you can have both done well, but they have to be thoughtful. And so when we think about, what is the government's role and what are tech companies' role, it's one of those things where it's like, who watches the watchman? So if we're going to give them this level of power, i.e. government or technology, then they have a due diligence to do right by people. They have a due diligence to do right by victims and anyone who's going to be there. And so, in our work, in victims of crime work, we have a lot of statutes and laws in the books, but where we struggle is that implementation of those laws. So how do we get our frontline law enforcement and court-based professionals and lawyers to understand how do they prosecute revenge porn or non-consensual intimate images? How do they prosecute financial fraud when there is a technology component and the person is that person's caregiver if it's an elder or older adult, right? There's all of these kind of outliers that I think play into that. But it isn't to say that we, have to create all of these new laws and statutes, because we have some really good ones on the books. But I do think there's a time and a place for everything. When we think about non-consensual intimate images, we didn't have anything on the books. And so for us, many advocates and victims were like, hey, we need something to address this because what we have now is not working. And so I think this is a conversation that government, tech companies, those of us in the work, victims, especially because we can't do this work without the victim's voice. We have to be all at the table to kind of think this through and plan and say, what is the gap here? What is the barrier here? Is it that the laws we have don't work and we need a new law? Or is it that we need to do a better job of equipping companies, equipping our law enforcement organizations, our court-based professionals in being able to get prosecution if that is what a victim wants? Because I think the other piece here is that many victims don't even want to go through. Again, why? Because of privacy. their name gets dragged through the mud. They have to go to court. They have to put their most intimate moments in front of a judge. And so oftentimes victims will say, I just want it taken down. I just want it to be reported to the FTC. I just want this website removed. And that is okay. And so, those also lead to privacy implications, because it could be an alternative tool for someone who may not want to be public, but can still seek recourse. And so I think it's a unified effort that has to happen between tech companies, the government, and NGOs and victims, where we begin to have these conversations in a more meaningful, thoughtful way.
Thank you, Rachel. I think we are done with overview of what have happened. And before we move on to deeper into what we should be doing, what we want to see in the near future, I'd like to share the results of the poll. Our attendees just answered if they've ever seen private information about themselves or their family members on the internet that they didn't want to be public, which is pretty much doxing in a way. And I think 44% say that they have, which I think is slightly terrifying, but also 90%, so like a fifth of respondents don't actually know. And so the question here for I would suggest Vlad to kick off. Vlad, what do you think about these results? Is this consistent with what we see generally? Does this make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I also wanted to vote in that poll because I have information on me on the internet which I'd like to be removed, but I have no idea why, even like me being deep into this topic. And here, what I'd like to say is that for many people, they ask, what is the first step that I should take if I care about my privacy? So I'm starting to care about my privacy. What should I do? And the first thing to do is just go online and try to search for yourself, search for your phone number, search for your name, for your credentials, for email address, and just look with amazement at how much actually can be out there on you. And so, yes, this is a problem that a lot of data is out there on us, and because we put it someday back into the past, we didn't know what it was, or because of data. And yeah, this all starts with awareness. So I suggest like people go Google yourself or DuckDuckGo yourself.
Thank you. John and Rachel, would you like to add something? Okay, moving on. So let's talk about 2022. We're almost a month in, and probably talk about the next few years too. What keeps you guys awake at night, and what are you excited about when thinking about data privacy? I know we kind of touched upon this topic just earlier, but maybe there are certain things that you're expecting and can't wait to see, and you anticipate that this might happen and will result in a positive outcome in the near future. John, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. I am pleased to think that we're going to see a number of the privacy preserving technologies we've been talking about advance. We're going to see more and more of these things being rolled out, more people using them. It's good that we're starting to see competition among the companies in who can do privacy better. That's going to be a way that we're going to get a number of things that we never even thought of coming up. We're starting to see mail systems doing things like fighting back against tracking images, tracking pixels in emails by having the service itself go get this thing that was used to track someone. That's now a feature that a few mail providers are doing for people who are using mail there. Like I said, we're seeing far more privacy preserving tools, and those features moving into the standard tools. I'd like to see governments looking at more how they empower people directly rather than taking the power for themselves. Because when we're trapped between a multinational company and a government, it is difficult for us to get the good outcome that I'm reminded of a saying, when the elephants dance, it's the grass that gets trampled. And that's one of the things that I'm concerned about, is that there are all sorts of legitimate bad things going on, and we drag out one of them and then we drag out the other one and we say, well, what about this bad thing? Well, I'll see your bad thing and raise you another bad thing. When what we really ought to be doing is looking at how we increase privacy for people at large, especially people at the margins, because that's where the bad stuff is going on. And it's also where things get put into place and we can't get rid of them. And then the abuses move to the rest of society. So we need to protect the vulnerable people first, because that's where the bad stuff shows up first.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think, as always, Jon does just such a great job of articulating what I'm thinking so well. So I appreciate your wisdom there, Jon, because I think you make some really good points in that. As we think about 2022, I remember when I first started doing this work almost 10 years ago, people were like, oh my God, social media, what do we do? Snapchat, our kids are gonna run rampant, what do we do? And I remember talking to the advocates I work with, and one of the things I said is like, social media at the time, I said about social media is like rock and roll. It's not going anywhere. And I think the same can be said for the stage of life that we're in right now, is that it's not going anywhere. And so we as a society, as technologists, as service providers, have to adapt with the times. And unfortunately, for victim service advocates, they don't have the time to be well versed in a lot of this stuff. They're trying to help somebody escape violence and escape abuse. And so they don't get to spend that time. But there's organizations like the Safety Net Project at NNEDV and the work we do here at NCVC, where that is our job to kind of stay on top of that. And so that's kind of what we're going to have to do, because I saw a question come through about the metaverse, and I will say I'm not a technologist, but as we think about that, I think about it, as I said earlier, not only am I, having to think about the reality of the day-to-day violence that I'm experiencing, then I have to now think about the violence that's happening online through social media, my email. And now I have to think about what's going to happen in the metaverse. And that feels very overwhelming for someone who does this work. Right now, there's 3 types of places or whatever that I have to think of. One of the things that gives me hope is that these are just new tactics, but old behaviors. So whether I'm in the metaverse or whether I'm in real life, abuse is abuse. Coercion is coercion. Harassment is still harassment. And so we can still take some of the principles, the core of our work, our privacy by design, our technology by design. We can still take the core of the work that we do and apply it to these spaces. Will it have to adapt? Of course, but the core doesn't change. And so I think for me, as we move into 2022, that's something that I, charge people to remember, is that this can feel overwhelming. It can feel like, there's always so many bad actors or so much bad technology, but we still can use some of the same principles of safety planning, of securing your privacy and security settings, of 2-factor authentication, of not sharing information unless, if it's safe for you to do so. Like, those are the things that we do well. And so what do we do well, and how do we apply it here? And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about as we move into 2022, is how do we adapt? How do we become resilient? Because that's one thing I will say about victims of crime, is that we are forced to be resilient. We have to be resilient. And so how do we take that resiliency and apply it in this situation?
Thank you, Rachel. Vlad, would you like to share your take from a technical perspective? What do you think we should be looking at in 2022?
Well, for me, one of the main interests is machine learning, and what I mainly want to look at is how this problem that machine learning usually requires a lot of data, and it's about building big models to solve different issues, how it can be balanced with the requirements for privacy and stricter rules from governments on data protection. One of the examples of the technologies which I'm really want them to be developed deeply in the coming years is what is colloquially known as machine unlearning. For example, if we train a huge language model, which is a machine learning model which is trained on text to generate text, it so happens that if it's big, and modern ones are actually enormous, that these models, they memorize data. And actually, it is trained on open corpora of web text, so huge piles of web text. And it can memorize stuff about you. And how do you know if it's in there? How can you probe for that? How can you remove that data? Do you even know it's in there without, having the proper tools to understand? And this concerns many other models that are built on users' data. And for example, if this trend for stricter regulation continues. For example, according to GDPR, a company has to remove all the data on a particular person on request. But does that concern, for example, these machine learning models? And can you even remove that? This is a question. And this is one of the topics which I am professionally most interested in. And also what I think we might see in the future is, as John and Rachel said, people getting more interested into it. And also it's important for companies, for technologists, for activists to continue to educate people about why it is important to keep your data safe and private. How can you do that? And we also see from our side that people actually take a very keen interest in how to do that. For example, we have this portal called privacy.kaspersky.com, which is basically a book of recipes on how to make your social networks more private. And over the last year, we've seen a twofold growth into the number of people who visited it. And they visited different pages dedicated to different services, and I hope it helped people to make their social networks and their pages on the internet more private. And I hope we will see this trend of people having more interest in that going forward.
Thank you, Vlad. So Vlad mentioned a tool, but I think there's plenty more tools for privacy that need to be developed. Well, I would imagine so. John, a question for you. What do you think from a technical perspective, besides what we already have, what kind of new tools and solutions do we need to develop in 2022? Or maybe, well, 1 year might not be enough, I suppose.
This is a multi-year adventure, just like it always is. And what Vlad was saying was spot on, that he's pointing out a bunch of things where I think it could be made better. That would again be like another all-day presentation. However, there are concepts that are in it, like that we should be allowed to go to someplace and say, I want to sever my relationship with you, and that everything has to go. And Vlad is right that this includes things like what might have been used with machine learning systems. And I'm sorry, that has to go too. I mean, that the reason that we have these regulations is that it is the concept that we are behind. The idea that we should be able to say, I want to get out of this, and I don't have to tell you why. I just want to be left alone now. So they have to figure out how to implement that. And that means that the people who are building these tools have to build them within that framework. And yes, that means that there's going to have to be more design work done. People are going to have to invent new things to do that. It isn't going to be something that happens in 2022, precisely because we don't yet have a lot of good ways about how to remove things from models. But they're going to have to do that, because the reason that they have to is that we as a society have decided that that's the way things ought to work.
Thank you, John. Yeah, that's a very valid point. I suggest, since we don't have that much time left, we would move on to some of the questions from the audience. And I thank you so much for your insights. I hope this was very useful for our attendees. And delving into the Q&A, I think we ought to start off with a question about doxing, because this is something extremely tied to abuse. Well, it is essentially abuse in most cases. So the question is doxing culture the main topic for the next few years? Rachel, I would think.
Yeah, I think so. I think, in terms of who gets doxed and how, we don't necessarily look at it in terms of for intimate partner violence, as we're not, most folks aren't using doxing to say that, but is it a part of that? And I think, ultimately it's a part of gender-based violence. When we think about the way in which patriarchy and misogyny and all of that plays into it, it is all interconnected through that. And so I definitely think that we'll see more conversations happening around doxing, especially as people, women identified folks who are typically at the margins are becoming more public and becoming, in these spaces more, and what that looks like in terms of power and privilege. And so I could see doxing being a conversation that will move on the next couple of years. We've been having it for the last couple of years in terms of if folks remember, like Gamergate and doxing and swatting and all of that. And so we have tended to have that conversation around doxing with swatting, because I think both of those two sorts of, I'll call them crimes, I guess, are prevalent and are happening. So I would agree with our attendee that we will see this kind of conversation moving forward, and people really thinking about, again, what does it mean when your data is public? So for example, I've worked with several victims of crime who are influencers, and so how can I be public but private? If my job is to be public, but I'm a victim of abuse, then do I run the risk of being doxxed or swatted or whatever because of the nature of my job? Is there no security for folks in that kind of arena? And so thinking about what that means for information sharing. And I think the other part about this too is like what is the access to the person, right? So thinking about, how do I limit what other people have access to me? I was just talking to two of my interns this morning, and one of the conversations I had was, even if I choose to be on media or use my technology, companies like, for example, in my community, I own a home, and so that's public record. I vote, that's public record. So like, there's a lot of stuff that is out there about me that I just don't have control over. And so I think when we have these conversations about doxing, it's really about, again, who has access to me and why, and how do we begin to have conversations about where that information lives and why it is, that people have access to it.
Thank you, Rachel. Vlad, would you like to add anything on the topic?
Actually, I think that Rachel's answer was very comprehensive, and I don't think I have anything to add to that. So thank you.
Fair enough. John, anything from you?
As Rachel said, you know, we're birds of a feather here. We believe in all of the same stuff.
Yeah.
And as someone who has been a system builder and designer, a lot of what we need to be doing is to looking at how we build these systems and figure out how we make them be better. Many of the communities that have been built, many of these social media have been built with this assumption that out on the internet, we're all friends. And that was essentially their idea. And people who said, hey, wait a minute, we're not all friends out there, were, oh, you're just being negative. And now we know that it's negative, and we need to go back and start refining and rebuilding our things that are out there so that they take into account the fact that everybody has someone that they just really don't want to talk to, like, at all. And how do you build your framework that is an online framework that looks after and follows the same sort of rules that your offline set of friends and all will do? How does that get reflected into things like regulations? Like, for example, yes, I mean, there are all sorts of things that are public records, and there are a number of communities that are starting to think that while something is a public record, maybe you ought to have to drive to that place to get it. I mean, you know, it shouldn't necessarily, you know, it's public record, but it's a public record that shouldn't be accessible to 7 billion people. And figuring out how we do these sorts of things and say that it can't be either everything or nothing. We have to have something in the middle. And how do we rebuild our systems and rethink them to do that is going to be one of the things we have to do in the next few years.
Thank you, John. We actually have another question on doxing. So to wrap things up, I would just, the question is actually what impact doxing has in the corporate environment and a gamer environment. And before we address that, I wanted to share some of my thoughts, because we actually spent last year thinking and talking about doxing. We developed a course about how to avoid being doxed, essentially, because we learned that most people don't even understand that this can happen to them. But I think a scary thing as well was that we did a global study on, well, online dating, which is a huge thing and will continue growing. And we learned that every 10th user has been doxed in terms, like if they like online user that used something like Tinder or Bumble or not has been doxed. It's like every 10th person. I think it's terrifying, and it's a trend that just keeps growing. And that's what I wanted to say. When it comes to corporate or gaming environment, my take would be that, especially in gaming, I know this female gamers often have to deal with this, but possibly Rachel, John, maybe you have something more to say about this.
Sure, yeah, and my very best friend is a girl gamer, and she does her cosplay, and so she would appreciate this conversation right now, because we have it. I'm not a gamer, but she tries to explain it to me. And so I think about the ways in which, you know, if you take gaming out of it, but you think about how someone navigates their life, right? So if I'm a victim of doxing, I now am having to navigate my information being shared. I'm having to navigate security and privacy. And then when you add that to a community where historically has not been friendly to women, to people of color, and so there is a level of fear that comes with being doxxed. There's a level of shame. There's a level of, you know, my best friend talks all the time about the community of friends she has from her gaming community. And that gets taken away when someone gets doxxed, because they no longer feel like this is a safe space for them. For again, we talk about digital divide and people at the margins, and gaming community tends to be that safe space for folks like that. And so when someone is being doxxed, they feel like the one and only place where they can be themselves is now being taken away. And so it's really thinking about how do we, again, not penalize the top, but change the behavior, right? Because this is a behavior issue. Someone's choosing to do this thing. And so when we allow for jokes, bad jokes, demeaning jokes, misogynistic, racist, homophobic jokes to happen in these spaces, that leads to doxing. When we allow for body shaming and all of that, that allows for doxing. So it's the little things that we do in those spaces that leads to these bigger issues around doxing, around swatting, around intimate partner violence, domestic violence, stalking, dating violence, all of these what are considered these gendered-based crimes. But it begins at the very beginning. And so it's a culture shift. It's a mind shift that we have to, as a community, start holding each other accountable in these spaces. And so, for me, I look at it from that lens, in that when we start to think about accountability, we're calling out people who are doing these misogynistic or homophobic or whatever jokes. We're talking to gamers, those who build games, about why do all the women look a certain type of way? Let's have different body types. Let's have people with disabilities. Let's have people that represent the diverse community that we all live in. And so it's these initial conversations that I think are going to be had. And so as I think about that, I think about the what can we do in our own community that will benefit in the long term, which leads to that doc.
Thank you, Rachel. Another question here from the audience: with the deployment of 5G and the Internet of Things, what are the risks to user privacy in 2022? Who would like to take this one?
Well, I can start because I had started typing an answer back to the person and I got I got waylaid. But I think first, let me cancel that. I think it's a lot of things. So when we think about the Internet of Things being interconnected, so let me just, before I say her name, so like my Alexa device sits right here next to me, and I have my Nest thermometer, and so it's everyday things that, again, I said this at the beginning, it's everyday things that are going to be misused, that are being misused. I think people jump to the stalk-aware and to the some of these kind of more glamorous things like what was the word I was thinking of? I can't think of the other type of crime I was thinking of, but regardless, those things are important, right? They're serious things to talk about, but my abuser is probably going to use my Alexa device to make me appear to be unfit to care for my children by hearing voices, by turning the lights on and off. I worked with a victim whose partner was a computer expert, and he had their whole home wired to their internet. And the only place she could go to be safe in her house was her bathroom with the door locked, because that was the only place that it was not connected to some form of internet connected device, because he would turn the heat up, then he would turn it down low. He would turn the lights on, he would blare music all times of the day, he would drop in on their devices. And so the bathroom was the only safe place she could be. And so as we think about how, there are risks to using these interconnected devices, there's going to be risks for anything, right? There's always a risk to using technology. And again, it's really helping victims and users understand risk management. So it's not to say that if I implement all of these things that I'm not going to be a victim, because people were perpetrating these types of crimes before technology even became a thing. But it is to say that I can manage some of the risks that come with using these sorts of interconnected Internet of Things devices. And I think the other piece about that too is we have to look at it from two lenses. First is, like I talked about, the lens of intimate partner violence, or someone in my community, my family, having access to me. But it also is these tech companies having access. So data breach, right? So if there is a data breach and someone gets access to my cloud recordings or my cloud device or any of my information, that could also put me at risk. So it's a twofold conversation that has to be had around the intimate issues of what's happening, but also the more global issue of breaches and information sharing. A long time ago, we talked about a victim who she was a teenager and had gotten pregnant, and she ended up getting all of these different Target, which is like a store here. She had gone there, bought some stuff, and Target started sending her targeted ads for her maternity journey. And her parents were like, wait, what's going on? Well, they found out she was pregnant, right? Because she was getting these targeted ads for baby products. And they know that women tend to buy certain products at certain stages of their pregnancy journey. And so that was a simple way in which information about this woman was shared with her parents in a way that maybe she wasn't ready to share. But thinking about how does that information about us that gets collected by companies get shared to people around us? Does CVS or does my pharmacy have my phone number and my zip code? For victims of crime who are in address confidentiality programs, that's a really big issue because they are trying to hide themselves from, abusive partners, and they can't give their phone number out. They can't give their address out. They can't even order pizza to their home because their address could be in some sort of system that could lead to risk. And so, it's a two-part conversation that has to be had.
Thank you, Rachel. We have one last question before we wrap up. So this one we go to Vlad. It's about Metaverse. Already partly mentioned it, but with a bit of different angle. What implications will the future adoption of the Metaverse have for user privacy?
This is a very interesting question because when we think about Metaverse, the biggest implication for privacy is that all your actions in the metaverse are basically electronic actions, meaning they can generate data, and this data might be recorded, analyzed, and used for unknown purposes. And this approach dates back like a few dozen years, that this approach called big data, which says, let's collect all the data on people, let's record it, and just figure out what to do with it later. And maybe this data is not needed, maybe this collection is absolutely unnecessary, but it's still done. So what I think this also will happen with this metaverse thing, if it ever gets popular and rolled out. But my hot take here is that actually as far as the privacy is concerned, for many applications, for many situations, we are already living in a kind of metaverse. And one example is what Rachel mentioned, is shopping, because the history of retail shopping in the last 50, 40 years is the history of increased data collection. For example, it started with loyalty cards, right? So a shop wants to understand what goods you like, what kind of person you are. Do you like beer, or are you a wine person? Do you have children? Like, do you buy children-related products? Are you a man or a woman, etc.? And then as technology advanced, the more of the experience of shopping became digitized. So first, for example, if a shop has free Wi-Fi, then they can track you. They can understand who you are by tracking your Wi-Fi MAC address, the physical address of your phone. So basically, this is not an option anymore because many devices randomize this address. But then they say, okay, let's log in to have free Wi-Fi access. As not many people know, but other technologies were used also to track, for example, which shelves do you look at for longer time, for example, Bluetooth, or even ultrasonic sounds that are unaudible for people were recorded by some applications to, again, track what advertisement you look at, what shops you visit, etc. And so cameras, right? And we still have loyalty cards, right? So this shopping experience is so digitized and it's so tightly tracked, at least in those companies that invest into it, that it's not that different from a metaverse. And another example, exams at universities, at colleges. If I myself had my exams a few years ago before the pandemic, people who are taking their exams now, they have to be monitored by proctoring software. And this is stuff that actually, what was interesting last year, that many students actually took a stance against. We don't like to be monitored in our own homes by some intrusive proctoring software, right? And another example, which is just fresh and hot, yesterday's article from BuzzFeed about prayer apps. So there are basically prayer apps that people use to pray, because like praying and religion is a social activity, and it's also digitized. So much is digitized that I don't think Metaverse actually might change much in respect to how much data we are already producing. So what I hope is that by the time, if Metaverse actually becomes the like everyday stuff that everyone uses, we have responsible data practices for how we handle data, how we train machine learning models, how we deal with all this privacy stuff, and that it just apply the same to the Metaverse.
Thank you a lot. So moving on to our final part, I would like to invite you all to share your final thoughts, basically, something that you would like to stick with the audience before we all say goodbye to each other. Jon, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. I think that it's important to realize that we are starting to make real progress on things because we're thinking about the edges. I've built systems for large numbers of people for a number of years. And when you start building a system that hundreds of millions of people will use, then you end up in a situation where the 99% case is not good enough. Because, you know, if you look at it, there's 300 some million people in the US, 400 some million in the EU. 1% of that is over 3 million people in the US, over 4 million people in the EU. I saw somebody here from Mexico that's, would be over 1 million people there. And that's just, you only got it to the 99% case. You have to get these things that work out on the margins correctly. We have to have things that work for almost everyone and have cases in them that deal with marginal things where we take into account stuff like, I have a connected house. How do I throw out everybody but me? That's really the thing that Rachel was talking about, is that nobody has gone in as a designer and said, all right, you have this house. You don't know who was in it. How do you clean up? How do you know that these things are back to normal? And that's something that we haven't done yet. And we need to do it because these are the weird questions that sound funny at the time. And in many cases, it's hard to get people to think that this is important. It used to be that when we talk about security things, people would say, well, why would anyone do that? And now when we're moving to a number of the sorts of abuses that Rachel deals with all the time, good people will say, well, why would anyone do that? And the answer is this stuff happens, you have to take care of it. I mean, that's just it. These things happen, you have to take care of it. You can't just turn your eyes away.
And I think I would just say, lastly, that, I use the word advocate, but all of us on this call are advocates for victims, whether we are technologists, reporters, whether we work with victims every day. We have the ability to advocate for users, for victims, for anyone who's utilizing technology in their everyday lives. And so, to my point about privacy and safety, they go hand in hand all the time. And so we just kind of have to remember that whatever we do, that we are keeping victims at the forefront of what we do and to applying them. I always say more knowledge is better than no knowledge. And so more knowledge doesn't always just mean we're putting out more policies and procedures, but it means, is it transparent enough for the everyday person with maybe a 6th or 7th grade reading level to understand what it is that they're reading and they're comprehending? And so keep that in mind as you all do your work. And I appreciate being a part of this conversation today.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, everyone. Thanks to all attendees for being here. As a reminder, there will be a recording of this session and we will share it with you. And have a good day, evening, morning for some. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.